Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luke Blackburn of Edgehill University, and I'd like to welcome you all to this conference entitled The Holy Land, Peace, Promises and Problems, 1096 to 1918. I'd like to thank all our panelists for being a part of this collaboration between Edgehill University and the International Centre of Racism. Throughout these sessions, if you have any questions.
Hi there, my name is Grace Selinger. I am a student in this course, and I would like to present our next speaker. Let me just give a brief introduction about Professor Louis Fishman. Louis Fishman is an associate professor in the history department at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. He's the author of the book Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Empire, 1908 to 1914, Claiming the Holy Land, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in January of 2020. His academic work focuses on late Ottoman Palestine, the Jews in the Ottoman Empire, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is also a regular contributor for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, where he writes mostly about Turkish and Israeli politics. He divides his time between New York, Istanbul, and Tel Aviv. And now I am glad to present Professor Louis Fishman.
Great, thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay? You can hear me? Thanks so much for the nice introduction. Just everyone, give me Grace, can you hear me okay? Just making sure.
I can hear you okay. Can everybody else?
Okay, great, very good, yeah, very good. Okay, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me today. I think I have about 20 minutes to speak, and then we can get to questions. Today, I'm also going to be sharing my PowerPoint share screen, and we'll get started here. So you can see that also, I'm sure now. So first of all, once again, thanks for having me. It's a really fascinating day to sit and listen to the great speakers and fantastic questions. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and talk about a bit about my book. Like I said, I'll be about 20 minutes. So the book is named Jews and Palestinians, Late Ottoman Era, 1908, 1914, Claiming the Homeland. And this is what, I figured when I'm not going to go back how I got to this, but I had originally been working more on modern Palestinian affairs in the 1970s, went back to the 30s. And right when I was about to end my graduate work, I said, wow, I'm going to go back to the Ottoman era. That's how I got to the Ottoman era. And it really changed my way of thinking completely about the conflict itself. So I'll share with some ideas now, and then later on in the afternoon, in the final panel, we can look more at the issues of historiography also. So what does this book go ahead and do? Some of the main arguments are, the overarching arguments is that following the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Palestinians and Jews each began to transform into political communities, forming distinct local identities and realizing the need to take concrete steps to what I call claim their homeland or claim the homeland. Palestinians during this time also came to see themselves as a community independent of Syria, while the local Jewish community opted out for separation from and not integration with the overall Palestinian population. And this stands in stark, there's a great difference if you look, for example, at the Jewish community in Cairo, in Baghdad, where Jews were actually integrating into the greater majority. Here in Palestine, we see that it's quite different. And this includes the Arabic-speaking Jews also of Palestine. By 1914, the minority Jewish community had become an independent actor, despite the growing protests of the Palestinian majority. And of course, most important of all, this was all happening in an Ottoman context. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen. This book set out to rewrite the history of the area within the context of late Ottoman period, and I argue does not read history backward by projecting the realities of today back in time. So what I sort of argue, and what I started understanding when I was writing this, is that we often Zionist history really starts at 1948, or Israeli independence, the Nakba, and then it goes for the Israeli narrative. It goes back. This is how did we reach this point? And they basically connect the dots. They go backwards. 1948. Well, you have also the Holocaust part of the history. You have rise of the Nazi Party in the 30s, mass immigration, so forth. British Mandate, 1917, second Aliyah and first Aliyah. So this whole book really challenges the Zionist narrative of Aliyot. It demonstrates that also to understand the collapse of the Palestinian society in 1948, one actually must go back to the Ottoman era. It was during this period they forged their first acts of resistance. And C, probably the most important part of, or one of the main arguments, is that both Jews and Palestinians did not predict the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So I look at each community separately. In the book, after the first chapter is something much more integrative, but then some of the main arguments are separate. So looking at Palestinian and what I call Palestinianism. Understanding Palestinians, this book understands Palestinians not through the lens of the giant Jewish minority. So up until now, it seems as if that the Palestinians only really become interesting within the history when seen through the lens of the Jewish minority. This is not how we study Syrians or Egyptians or any other nationalist movement, meaning we only understand the Palestinians only are seen through the lens of a Jewish minority, despite making up 85% of the overall population. So I argue they are an independent factor with a rich history, and that a unique Palestinian identity emerged during the late Ottoman era, and not just as a reaction of Zionism, which is key. One whole chapter, the Haram al-Sharif incident, highlights this. It has very little to do with Zionism at all. Now, this book also argues that there's a need to treat Palestine as independent of Syria or southern Syria, which seems to be much more of a result of post-World War I realities. I'm going to come back to this. This does not disregard the fact, of course, that they all also had strong ties with Syrian Arabs. However, it was clear they lived in Palestine and were increasingly referring to themselves as Palestinians. So, for example, here's a poem in the newspaper Philistine from 1914. O Palestine, you have slept for so long. O Palestine, your glory is withering away. O my people, if we only knew our reality, we would weep and mourn over the loss of land. O my homeland, you have fallen into the hands of the enemy. You have been plundered and are under the injustice of those paid. My land, save my homeland, my heart, spirit. So what do I define as Palestinianism? I argue and I put forth that this denotes the essence of what it meant to be a Palestinian before the nation state, before the rise of nation state nationalism, when in the late Ottoman era, a modern notion of patriotism to Palestine began to be expressed among the local Arab population. This acted within one's identification as an Ottoman, Arab, Muslim, or Christian. It also included understanding of the homeland as resonating across different levels. You have urban notables, new educated elite, village leaders, peasants, and there was an interchange of ideas between these different groups. And then finally, by 1914, terms like Palestinian people, Shab al-Falastini, Ahl Palestine, become more and more common. So how do I reach this? I bring in, besides the fact that this is a really interesting experiment to look at advertisements, and that a normal advertisement that we all see in the newspaper Palestine, it's online now, the whole newspaper, you can find it, is I look at this Tuborg beer commercial, And then, it says if you want a nice cool drink, right, in the summer, to go and open up a Tuborg beer. So it's interesting for so many reasons. But I look at the very end, it says, Yusuf Elena el-Wakil al-Mumi, Yusuf Elena, the general distributor to Palestine was Syria. So I look at that sometimes defining Palestine does not need to be super complicated, that people in Palestine referred to it as Palestine and understood it as Palestine. And as academics, sometimes years later, debate these things, right? But they don't have to be that huge. Then it was clear. I also look at the letterhead of the Chief Rabbinut in Eretz HaKodesh, in the Holy Land. This is from Jerusalem. And here the translation of Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, is clearly Philistine in Arabic. So we're talking about the same land here. This is Haham Basha Philistine, with Jamiat Taifa Israelin Sardim. So this is how they translate. In Arabic also, they translate the local Jewish population as Taifa, right? Sect, Israeli Sephardic sect, Jerusalem. Now, this comes from the term Bani Israel, the children of Israel, which was much more common in Palestine. To call Jews, Jewish settlements, for example, Koloniyat Israeliyat, the Israeli colonies. They're not talking about the Israeli state, to be very clear. This is way before Jews even imagined calling themselves Israeli. Now, the book then moves to Palestine's Jewish community. And I argue that, I myself do not define them as Palestinian Jews, including the local ones, but rather refer to them as the Jewish community in Palestine, or better known as the Jewish Yishuv. Defining Palestine's Jewish community is a difficult task. You have Ashkenazi, Sephardi, immigrants from Eastern Europe, Arab lands, the Balkans, North Africa. You have multiple languages among Yiddish, Russian, Ladino, multiple dialects of Arabic and Persian. But following the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, this hodgepodge of communities begin to unite under the banner of adopting Hebrew as their mother tongue. Already, all the newspapers were in Hebrew. They're all currently online. So if you go by 1910, you have 3 newspapers. In 1911, they're almost all of them are dailies by then, in Hebrew, and that was the adopting of Hebrew connected Zionist and anti-Zionist alike. That's something very central. So even anti-Zionists, someone like the very well-known Albert Entebbe, he was not against Jewish immigration ever, and believed in strengthening the Hebrew-speaking community in Palestine. Now, this is central to the book, is the fact that the Jewish community greatly, and I would say the far majority of them within the urban sphere, which they are the ones that are the movers and the shakers of the period, they were adopting an Ottoman patriotism. Now, why adopt an Ottoman patriotism? Well, I call it separation through integration, which was common among other non-Muslim groups and inherent to the spread of Hebrew as the dominant language. In other words, if you want to receive in the post-Young Turk Revolution some type of cultural autonomy, you're going to have to integrate, you're going to have to express your patriotism to the Ottoman homeland. Now, during this period, a local Zionism emerges, not just in Jerusalem, but also in Istanbul and other cities throughout the empire. The youth among the Sephardic Jews especially were attracted to Zionism, and Ottoman Jewish politicians were heavily influenced by the Zionist movement, or less by the movement, but more by this local type of pride in their Jewish identity. The Israeli historical narrative has written it out of the history, Ottoman Zionism. And that's something key that we can talk about later on the talk in the afternoon, over focusing on the contributions of the small groups of the second Aliyah. Let me check my, I think about 6 more minutes, and then we can go to questions. So this is what I'm, in terms of the Ottoman context and how this work can contribute to understanding the changes that were set in by the Young Turk Revolution is, first of all, we know, everyone knows, it's been well documented that following the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, there was a euphoric response across the board in Palestine. Jews, Christians, and Muslims celebrated together in Jerusalem, as well in Istanbul and other cities throughout the empire. However, this book challenges nostalgic descriptions of intercommunal relations, much found in the press, but does not discredit prevalent work showing these relations, rather uses it as a launching. So for me, freedom, hurriyet, and equality, musavat, was not ever supposed to be a horizontal type of equality, but one that provided an equal playing field for the different groups. When they're talking about a equality, they're not saying that Jews, Muslims, Christians are going to be equal with each other. Rather, it's Istanbul. The idea in Istanbul is that they're giving them equal playing field. So what we see is that Young Turks transfer powers to a secular elite, where each community would now renegotiate demands vis-a-vis this new bureaucratic Istanbul elite. The Ottoman Jewish community, whether in Palestine or Istanbul, also was using other non-Muslim communities as a model to receive autonomous rights. And quoting Vartkes Efendi Bey, the Ottoman Armenian parliamentarian, he says, freedom of language more than anything will show the people of the empire that the Ottoman flag is the best shelter for their national freedom, and this feeling will unite everyone together and will lead everyone in the greatest patriotism to the Ottoman homeland, and will enlighten everyone together to love the flag. So I'm not going to go into great detail now on each chapter, but I'll just say a few words on this. That some of the things, chapter 2, key to this chapter is showing there was common bonds among being formed among many Palestinians, regardless of the social and religious affiliations, Christian or Muslim, and they were uniting to confront issues such as the continued Jewish migration, British imperialism, very importantly, Palestinian immigration, the poor state of the peasant. And Palestinian immigration, the fact that Palestinians were leaving was part of that formula, and they really believed that Zionism or the Zionist movement proved a threat to their own existence. It's not that Jews are just coming, it's Palestinians are leaving. And we also see, very important, we have, through Ottoman petitions, we have voices from peasants, muhtars, and notables. We get a really interesting view of different parts of the society. Also, there are now Palestinian university students in Cairo and Istanbul that define themselves as such. Now, I'm going to quickly jump to the Jews of Palestine, children of the first Aliyah, avid Zionists. Some of them start joining the Ottoman army out of this patriotism. And we have Bin Karmi, who's the son of Aaron Eisenberg, the founder of Rehovot. He fights in the Balkan Wars. He falls POW in World War I and finally dies teaching Hebrew in the POW camps. So he's a really, really interesting character. But we see that the first generation that was born in the land, whether they were local Jews, Sephardic Jews, or Ashkenazi, the children of Ashkenazi immigrants, there's this motivation of this new type of Ottoman patriotism. You see the joining of the army that actually more among Ashkenazis that were new to the empire, and they were able to shape their ideologies and their identities in a very different way than the local Sephardic population. And in the end, let me just do some concluding remarks. I'm going to skip over this and I'm leave time for questions. But I will say that to stress the fact that through the Ottoman documents and through newspapers, whether it's the Jewish press or the Arab press in Palestine, we really see how great the divide was between the different communities. And I also stress that this is among, and I've done some new work that's not here in this PowerPoint, among some of the notables from the Jewish Sephardic population, Arabic speakers, whether it's Shimon and Esther Moyal, they've been painted or they've been, in other research, we see that they were somehow much closer to the local Palestinian population. I argue they weren't. They were actually closer to the Egyptian Cairo scene, and they were able to integrate into Cairo. This is Nissim Malul also, who worked for the Zionist movement. But in Palestine, that divide was already there in 1908. So what we see is a merging, coming together of two separate communities. And let me stress, the Jewish community includes Zionist and non-Zionist, because it was the chief rabbi of Istanbul that was responsible often for the closing of Palestinian papers, claiming they were anti-Semitic, when really they were clearly anti-Zionist. So that whole debate, we didn't talk about that, but the debate over what is Zionism and what is anti-Semitism really takes hold in Istanbul during this year. What we see is in Istanbul, this is motivated often by anti-Semitism, but in Palestine, it's very different. So I'll go ahead and stop there. And I look forward to any questions some of you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fishman. So we do have a couple questions already coming in. Dr. Irving actually asked, how is the term yishuv used at the time you're talking about? How common is it amongst Jews, 1908, to think of themselves as a yishuv versus thinking of themselves as attached to the individual communities? What ways do different people use the word yishuv? Does it vary depending on community, political position, etc.? Does its use now carry the danger of obscuring diversity?
Thanks so much for that question. I would have to go over, I did not do a systematic study of the term yishuv. This is a term that I have adopted more. What I would say was, yes, you see many different ways they describe themselves. Within the book itself, I do highlight the different communities, but by I would say 1911, 1912, it's clear that the most dominant movement among the Jews is the adopting of Hebrew. And that Hebrew, the fact that they're adopting Hebrew and not Arabic, right, as the local language, places them in merging of a united community. Now, within that united community, you of course had numerous, as you know, numerous different communities expressing and retaining their own identities. And I think that's key, meaning adopting Hebrew didn't mean that you're leaving your identity. Rather, in a sense, your communal identities are retained while you are now creating links between the other different Jewish groups, once again, whether Zionist or non-Zionist, right? And I think that's something important. Now, to your question once again about the yishuv, I am looking in future work to start trying to define better, to understand, we see often that they define it as Eretz Israel. They're living in Eretz Israel. We see them often defining as just Jerusalem. And we see each community referred to the other as their own community at times. But you do see the word yishuv appear. I use it because definitely, lastly, is also, I'm going to say that this community also is looking to Arabs as a model how to become a people. And I think that's something really, really interesting. You know, we always hear the claim that Palestinians learned from the Jews what nationalism was. You have great debates in the newspaper Hachirut and others saying, let's look at the Arab people, how they're making gains and becoming a nation with, you know, with ideas and with unity. We need to use them as an example. So that also comes into the picture. Very rarely do they refer to it as themselves as Palestine living, but you do see it sometimes. Sometimes it's called Palestina, sometimes Palestine, depending on what context is used.
All right, thank you very much. We do have another question from Professor Renton that he had to direct message me, so I will read it. How did religion affect Palestinian identities? To what degree, if at all, were Muslims more attached to an Ottoman identity than Palestinian Christians? Was there a difference between a Muslim notion of Palestine and a Christian one in this period?
That's thanks for the question. In my eyes, that by 1912, 1913 is where you have a very interesting model that we has emerged, where the two groups have really, they're using each other or they're working together with each other. So, for example, Philistine always has, you know, they on one hand they have the beer commercial. These are Christians, and the whole question of the beer, what beer was, if it's alcohol, that's a whole different thing. How many Muslims were actually drinking? Many Muslims were drinking. Different things. We could talk about that. But going to the question that you're looking at is that Philistine always had Raghib el-Khalidi give a sermon, Islamic sermons. So it has, the newspaper itself has a very sort of Muslim tone to it. Now we know that during different periods, there are at times tensions, such as the Libyan, the Italian invasion of Libya leads some Muslims to protests, and in these protests, some anti-Christian sentiments emerge, and they discuss this and they talk about it. So what I would argue is that by this period, the notables really, as you pointed out, are connecting themselves more and more on one hand to the empire. We know that we have, you know, the three MPs, members of parliament, were all Muslim, but we did have Sakikini ran for part of them wanted to enter the parliament. He didn't succeed. We have the more traditional families. We have the Husseinis and Nashashibis, and Khalidis, vying for power in the parliament. But we also have the Christian Palestinians adopting the peasant cause, avidly adopting the peasant cause, which is overwhelmingly, of course, Muslim. So we do see these different groups merging together, that by 1914, there is a clear idea that Palestinian or Palestinian is both Jews and Muslims. So, you know, what I think is most interesting is how quickly this happens, you know, over time. If we compare it to something, I compare it to the Egyptian national movement, which also included Jews. We have to say the Egyptian national movement was very different in this case. It was a different place. But what we do see is that the Dinshaway incident sort of sparks, you know, journalists adopting the peasant cause. So in Palestine, this really, the different groups started understanding their interconnectedness and relying on each other, uniting together, and leaving one part more to the Muslim communities, another part more to the Christian communities as well.
We actually have another question. This will be our last question before we take a 15-minute break before the next speaker. How would you assess today the arguments made by Rashid Khalidi in his classic book, Palestinian Identity? And do you see your work challenging Salim Tamari's huge emphasis on the First World War and explaining the birth of a political Palestinian identity?
So first of all, I think with the question with Rashid Khalidi, was it how my work contradicts or?
The question is about Rashid Khalidi is how would you assess today the arguments made by them in his classic book? And
perfect.
then,
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, so first of all, I'm just, sorry, disclaimer, I'm a student of Rashid Khalidi. He's my professor. So I see my work greatly as an extension of his own work, meaning my work, I would never, so many people have contributed to this field. And in some senses, with my book coming out a little later, I took a few break and went to journalism and came back more to academics. And I had that time for other new exciting work to come out and books to come out. I do think that my book makes maybe a stronger claim for Palestinian identity. I would say that not a stronger claim, I would say it complements Khalidi's work completely. I do bring in, for example, Ottoman peasant petitions. I mean, Palestinian peasants and petitions that are sent directly to Istanbul. They don't trust the local notables that these petitions will get there. So in that sense, I think I was able to discover new forms of Palestinian identity. And that's where I come up with this Palestinianism. You know, let's move on the question of, we always get stuck on this question of, were they people, were they a people, or they weren't a people? Was this nationalism, was this not? And I started sort of collecting ideas. Now, I would also say that my work very much so complements, has grown through the work of Salim Tamari also. So I mean, his work on World War I, remember I stopped right at World War I. And to tell you the truth, I'm slowly venturing into this. So World War I transforms, as Khalidi states, in his book, transforms this into a whole new thing. Now, what I'm trying to say is that, and I think Salim Tamari would argue the same, is that we have to, what he does, we have to go back and look and understand this in an Ottoman context. And if both peoples were not able to foresee the fall of the empire, and we know this, in retrospect, we know it, then we really need to think how we're treating this. So really what I can say is that through the work of Khalidi and Tamari and a whole group of people working on the Ottoman period, today things have changed quite a bit. And we really are, I think, starting to understand how much more we actually have to learn about it. Because we have the Ottoman newspapers that are opening up, easily searched now. We have more and more documents. There's thousands of documents on Palestine that have been opened in the Ottoman archives. Just the peasant petitions I'm talking about. There's still so much more that I wasn't able to put in this book. So there's a lot out there. For that, I would highly encourage learning Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Hebrew. I think they all are very, very important.
All right, thank you so much to Dr. Fishman. We are actually going to take a 15-minute break, so we'll be coming back at 3:32 to start our next session of speaking. I think we can turn our cameras off, I think, but yeah, we'll be back then.
We could only want great students like this group that put this together, so thanks so much.